The wind hit me first, sharp and endless, and I knew before I even opened my eyes that the heater had failed again. My name is Alira Doyle, and I was lying in the snow of a dead mining moon called Kirath 9, holding my daughter Elsa against my chest, praying to whatever was still listening that she was only sleeping. She was not sleeping. Her small hand had gone still in the fabric of my collar. Her breath, which had rattled so weakly against my neck for the last 3 days, had simply stopped sometime in the night, and I had not even felt the moment it happened. That is the cruelest part of losing someone slowly. You keep waiting for a sign, and then one day you realize the sign already came and went while you were looking the other way. I want to tell you how we got here, because the story does not start with snow. It starts with fire. 6 weeks earlier, our convoy was crossing the outer trade lanes when 3 warships broke formation and opened fire without warning. I do not know which side struck first, and by the time our transport ship spun out of control, it did not matter anymore. We crashed on Kirath 9 because the moon's gravity caught us like a trap, and there was nothing left to do but survive the landing. There were 3 of us who walked away from the wreckage: myself, my daughter, and a trader named Callum Reyes, who had shared our transport for the last leg of the journey. Callum knew how to ration the little power we had left. He knew how to seal a cracked heater coil with nothing but wire and patience. For 11 days, he kept the 3 of us breathing. On the 12th day, he went out to check the wreckage for spare parts and did not come back. I found him 2 hours later, frozen against a fallen support beam, his hand still reaching toward the toolkit he never made it to. I did not have the strength to bury him properly. I only had the strength to close his eyes and whisper a thank you that felt far too small for what he had given us. After that, it was only me and Elsa. I sang to her every night, not because I believed songs could keep a person warm, but because singing was the only thing I could still control. Kirath 9 has no real seasons, only degrees of cold, and the last one before this had been the worst by far. Our heater cell finally failed on the 15th night, and I knew, somewhere deep in my chest, that we did not have another one to replace it with. So I sang anyway. I made up a lullaby that night, something about warmth waiting on the other side of the dark, about a mother who would carry her daughter all the way to it if she had to. I do not remember the exact words now. Grief has a strange way of erasing language before it erases anything else. I only remember the shape of the promise, and the sound of my own voice cracking under the weight of it. By the time I finished singing, Elsa was already gone. I do not know how long I sat there afterward. Time stops meaning anything when the only person you have left in the universe goes still in your arms. I remember screaming at some point, though I could not tell you if it was in words or simply sound, a raw noise tearing its way out of me because there was nowhere else for it to go. That is when I heard footsteps in the snow. I did not turn around at first. I assumed it was my own mind playing tricks, the kind of thing that happens when you have been alone with grief for too long. But the footsteps kept coming, crunching steadily closer, and then a shadow fell across the snow beside me. I looked up and saw something I had only heard stories about. A human, tall inside a rust-colored suit, a mining lantern swinging from one gloved hand, his breath fogging the inside of his faceplate. He must have heard my screaming from wherever he had been working, because there was no other reason for anyone to be out on this frozen ridge. He stopped a few steps away. I expected him to speak into a comm device, to call for backup, to treat me the way surveyors usually treat strangers they stumble across in dangerous places, which is to say, carefully and from a distance. Instead, he knelt down in the snow across from me, set his lantern down between us, and waited. He did not say anything at first. He simply stayed there, close enough that his shadow crossed mine, until my screaming wore itself down into something quieter. Only then did he move, slow and careful, the way you would approach something wounded and unpredictable, which I suppose I was. He pulled back the cuff of his glove and pressed 2 bare fingers into the snow beside Ilsa's small hand. I think he already knew what he would find. I think he did it anyway, because some truths need to be felt with your own skin before you can accept them, no matter what a screen or a scanner already told you. "I'm sorry," he said. His translator was old and clipped, and it mangled half of what came after. Something about a convoy, something about warmth, something about not letting me walk back alone. but those first two words did not need any translation at all. Grief, I have since learned, is the one language every species understands without training. His name was Owen Marsh, a surveyor working for a small human salvage guild that mapped abandoned mining moons for resources nobody else wanted enough to risk the cold for. Kirath 9 was not on any official rescue list. I was not registered on any manifest at all. He had no reason to go looking for the source of a faint, dying transmission crackling through a damaged relay somewhere on the ridge. He went looking anyway, because something in that static sounded like a voice, and he could not make himself ignore it. I do not remember agreeing to follow him. I remember his arm, steady and careful, helping me rise out of the snow. I remember that he did not ask me to leave Elsa behind. He lifted her himself, wrapped in the thermal liner peeled from his own suit, and carried her against his chest, the entire way back to his outpost, so that my arms, empty and shaking, did not have to. The walk back felt longer than the entire 6 weeks that came before it. Neither of us spoke much. Every few minutes, Owen would glance sideways to check that I was still moving, still breathing, still present in some form beyond the numbness that had settled into my bones. When we finally reached his outpost, a small metal structure buried halfway into the ridge, the warmth inside hit me so suddenly that my knees buckled. He caught me before I fell. He guided me to a chair near the heating unit and wrapped a blanket around my shoulders, without a single word of complaint about the cold that clung to my clothes. Then he set Elsa down gently on a cot nearby, arranging the thermal liner around her, with the same care someone might use for a child who was only sleeping. I watched him do this, and felt something strange rise in my chest, something I did not have a name for at the time. It was not relief, because relief requires hope, and I had none left. It was something closer to disbelief, the sense that a stranger from an entirely different world had just treated my daughter's body with more gentleness than the universe itself had shown either of us in the last 6 weeks. Owen did not ask me questions that first night. He gave me food, though I could barely eat, and water, which I drank only because my throat felt like it had been scraped raw from screaming. He sat across from me in silence, occasionally checking a small device on his wrist, and every so often, he would look up and simply ask if I needed anything, as if the answer might change from 1 minute to the next. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, because I woke to sunlight through a narrow window and the sound of Owen speaking quietly into a comm unit in the next room. I caught fragments of the conversation. He was requesting a proper transport, explaining that he had found a survivor, insisting that the child needed to be handled with dignity and not simply logged as cargo. When he noticed I was awake, he ended the call and came to sit near me again. "There's a ship coming in 2 days," he said. "It'll take you somewhere better than this, somewhere with people who can help." I asked him why he had come looking in the first place. Kirath 9 was enormous, and the odds of him hearing a weak transmission from so far away were small enough to be almost impossible. He thought about the question for a long moment before answering. "I heard something that didn't sound like wind," he said. "I couldn't just leave it alone." It was such a simple answer, and yet it stayed with me far longer than any grand explanation could have. He had no obligation to search for a stray signal on an abandoned moon. Kirath 9 held no rescue contracts, no bounties, no guarantee of reward. He had simply heard a sound that troubled him, and instead of dismissing it, he had walked out into the cold to find its source. Over the next 2 days, I learned more about him almost by accident, in the small gaps between silence. He mentioned a sister back on his homeworld who worked with recovered survivors from conflict zones. He mentioned that his own father had been a rescue diver, someone who spent his life pulling people out of collapsed structures and flooded tunnels, often at great risk to himself. Owen said this like it explained something about himself, though he never stated it outright. I began to understand that this instinct to search, to listen, to refuse to walk away from a stranger's suffering, was not unusual among his people. It seemed to run through them like a current, quiet but constant. When the transport ship finally arrived, it was larger than anything I had seen since the wreck, its hull marked with the same Salvage Guild insignia as Owen's suit. 2 more humans stepped out to help carry supplies, and I watched as they treated Elsa's small body with the same careful respect Owen had shown from the very first moment. There was no rush, no impatience, no treatment of grief as an inconvenience to be managed. They simply made space for it. the way you might make space for weather you cannot control. The journey away from Kirath 9 took several days. I spent most of it in a small cabin, staring out at stars I no longer recognized, trying to piece together what came next, now that the only thing I had been fighting to protect was gone. Owen checked on me periodically, never pushing conversation, simply making sure I was not alone for too long at any given stretch. On the third day, he told me something that changed the shape of my grief without erasing it. He said that the guild maintained a small memorial ground on a green world called Halden, a place with real seasons and real soil, where those lost during salvage operations, along with those they had failed to save in time, were laid to rest with proper markers. He asked, carefully, if I would want Elsa buried there instead of returned to whatever remained of the Ashen Concord's shattered territories. I said yes before he had even finished the question. We arrived on Halden 11 days later. It was the first time in months I had felt real wind that did not threaten to freeze my lungs. The first time I had smelled actual growing things instead of recycled ship air or the metallic tang of a dying moon. The memorial ground sat on a low hill overlooking a river, dotted with markers in dozens of different alphabets, evidence of countless species who had crossed paths with these humans, and their strange, stubborn compassion. Elsa was buried there on a quiet afternoon, her marker carved with her name in my own language, and beneath it, in the human alphabet as well, so that anyone who visited could know a small life had existed, had been loved, and had not been forgotten. Owen stood beside me during the ceremony, along with the two others from the transport ship, none of them saying much, simply present, simply there. I stayed on Halden after that. I told myself at first, it was only until I regained enough strength to travel further, to find whatever remained of my scattered people, but weeks turned into months, and I never quite found the will to leave. The guild offered me work translating between surviving members of the Concord and the human crews who had taken so many of us in, without demanding anything in return. It gave me purpose on days when purpose was the only thing keeping me upright. I learned the human language properly during that time, not through a broken translator crackling with static, but syllable by syllable, the way you learn something you intend to keep for the rest of your life. I learned that Owen's habit of listening for distant, troubled sounds was not some rare exception among his people, but something closer to a shared instinct, passed down and reinforced through generations of rescue workers, emergency responders, and ordinary people who simply could not walk past someone in need. I also learned, slowly, painfully, how to carry my grief without letting it consume everything else. Some days were harder than others. There were mornings I woke expecting to hear Ilsa's small breathing beside me, only to remember, all over again, that she was gone. But there were also mornings I woke to birdsong through an open window, to the sound of the river below the memorial hill, to Owen's quiet knock on my door, asking if I wanted to walk with him before his next assignment. Grief did not disappear, but it learned to share space with small, unexpected moments of peace. People on Halden sometimes ask me, carefully, the way you ask about a wound that might still be raw, why I trusted humans the way I did. They were, after all, a young species by galactic standards, impulsive, short-lived, prone to conflict among themselves in ways that often seemed baffling from the outside. I understood their hesitation. I had shared it once myself, but I always gave them the same answer. I trusted humans because one of them heard a stranger's cry from across an empty, frozen ridge on a moon that offered him nothing in return for helping her. He had no obligation, no reward waiting at the end of that walk through the snow. He simply heard something that sounded like suffering, and he could not make himself ignore it. That instinct, more than any weapon or any treaty, or any grand act of heroism, is what convinced me that this strange, stubborn, endlessly searching species deserved whatever trust I had left to give. Ilsa's marker still stands on that hill above the river, and I visit it often, usually in the early evening when the light turns gold across the water. Sometimes Owen comes with me, though he rarely says much during those visits. He simply stands beside me, the way he did that first night in the snow, present, steady, unwilling to let me carry the weight of remembering entirely alone. I do not know what the future holds for either of us, or for the scattered remains of my people, trying to rebuild something out of the wreckage the war left behind. But I know this much for certain. Somewhere out in that frozen, silver dark, something was crying, and a human heard it, and came anyway. And for reasons I am still learning to understand, that was enough to change the entire shape of my life.